Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the 2014 recipient of the Lindberg Award, today's speaker. There's Michael. Professor Michael Ferber, Professor of English and Humanities. Before I do so, I'd like to take a moment to congratulate our 2015 Lindberg Award recipient, Jeff Bolster, Professor of History. And I think Jeff is still out at sea, isn't he? Yes. Yeah. Professor Ferber earned his master's degree and PhD in English literature at Harvard and his undergraduate degree in Greek literature at Swarthmore College. He spent 7 years as an assistant professor at Yale and 5 as a nuclear disarmament lobbyist and researcher in Washington before arriving at UNH in 1987. Professor Ferber's scholarship focuses on romantic poetry. He's written 5 books about romanticism and edited 2. He has also authored a dictionary of literary symbols, the first dictionary of symbols to be based on literature. And he has just completed another book titled Poetic Fame. A recipient of a UNH Teaching Excellence Award, Professor Ferber teaches courses in romantic poetry and the epic tradition. He also team teaches in the Humanities program and occasionally offers courses on the history of nonviolent political action, the literature of Vietnam, and Shakespeare. For his outstanding work as both scholar and teacher, Professor Ferber has been recognized with the Lindberg Award, the highest award of the college. His lecture today is entitled Keeping Up. Please join me in welcoming Michael Ferber.
Thank you, Ken. That was very kind. I thought you were talking about somebody else for a minute. It's been a pleasure to be and an honor to be a professor in a college with such a good guy as Dean, as reasonable and fair-minded as a guy could be. Thank you for being Dean. Even when I've occasionally disagreed with Ken, I've sometimes thought, wait a minute, this is Ken Fold I'm disagreeing with. I must be wrong. So I think it is the tradition, I understand, to talk about your current work. And I thought about doing that, but I couldn't find a way to sort of boil down and make interesting or fun what I'm currently working on. So I'm going to talk about something else, a problem that I think afflicts at least all of us in English and probably all of us in the humanities and maybe more than that. I arrived at the English department on the same day as our provost and Briggs Bailey, who's sitting in the back there, 28 years ago. And we learned a lot about Gary Lindberg, who had died the year before, much loved and much admired. So it's particularly touching for me to be given the Lindberg Award, about whom I heard so much, though never got to meet. I'm also going to read this. If you went to hear Michael Roth last week, and I think many of you did, he obviously had given that talk 50 times. And I haven't. I haven't given this talk at all. So I'm going to read it. I apologize. I'd rather not usually do that, but I worked hard getting these sentences just right. So you're just going to have to bear with me. I begin with an epigraph from Balzac's novel, The Fatal Skin, from 1831. Herr Heine Vettermach estimates that the number of printed books is more than 1 billion, of which a man cannot read more than 150,000 in his lifetime. Thank you. I loved that. That made my day when I read that. We literature professors have a lot of anxieties. Most of them we talk about too often and too much, but one of them remains too sensitive for most of us to admit to, even to ourselves. A few years ago, a book came out that cuts to the quick of it. Comment parler des livres que l'on n'a pas lus. by Pierre Bayard, translated as How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. I haven't read this book. Of course, just a review of it. And I doubt if I'll have time to read it, interesting though it sounds, but I have something to say about it anyway. Of course. Bayard is bracingly honest. About us literature professors, he says this: if we have not yet got round to reading Ulysses, we find it too embarrassing to admit it, though he freely does. And we can nonetheless talk about it intelligently because we have always heard it talked about. How many of us have gotten through Proust? But we can all talk about his Madeleines and his long sentences and his involuntary memory. We can all sound very good on this. It's very hard for literary scholars to confess to large omissions like these because of what Bayard calls the sacralization of reading, which includes the obligation to read a book in its entirety, not to skim it, and certainly not to rely on reviews of it, as I am. So we fake it. I don't know if Bayard mentions it, but David Lodge made great use of this anxiety in his novel Changing Places from 1975, where professors earned points at cocktail parties by confessing their gaps. I still feel ashamed over my behavior on 3 or 4 occasions at cocktail parties as a junior professor at Yale, when I pretended to have read the book being talked about. The Fairy Queen. I had petered out after book 3. Eugene Onegin, and Nabokov's deadly translation had made me abandon it. Finnegan's Wake. Well, no apologies there. But now, as a senior professor here at UNH, where we are all a little less pretentious, I more readily conquer my shame and confess my gaps. Of course, I now have fewer of them to admit to, at least among the canonical works, for I did eventually finish The Fairy Queen, and I love Eugene Onegin in various translations other than Nabokov's, and never mind Finnegan's Wake. But it happens just as often as it did half a lifetime ago that someone wants to talk about a book I haven't read and ought to have read. There are now more such books than ever. This surely is the problem we all share and we feel nervous about, keeping up. And if it is difficult to be honest about it at parties, it is harder still to face its consequences for our professional work. I still meet scholars or read books by scholars who really seem to have read everything under the sun. And that fact makes me doubt just how typical I am with all my gaps and anxieties. As it happens, I'm a slow reader, even when I try to read fast, a fact that may be the effect, or maybe the cause, of my specializing in poetry. Even if I doubled or tripled my pace, however, I cannot imagine amassing the treasury of literary knowledge that these people seem to possess. And so now I doubt my impressions of them and wonder how they fooled me. They must read books at the rate of Balzac's Herr Heine Vettermach. If they planned on a life of 60 years of serious reading, they would have to read 2,500 books a year, or about 7 books a day. It's a commonplace to bemoan the ever-narrowing specializations of English professors, as well as professors throughout the humanities, and many causes have been proposed to account for them. One cause seems to be the professionalization of literary criticism and the consequent disdain of ordinary book reviewing and belletrism. Another factor is our imitation of the sciences under a research model, the regime of publish or perish, the quest for grants, and so on. All of these made worse by the financial crisis that most universities and colleges find themselves in. To these, I would add that universities as a whole have been pushed into a business model according to which the university is a factory that makes 2 kinds of products: students and research. We take high school graduates as raw material and add value to them, which is measured by outcomes, mainly the salary they get on their first job. Research is also measured quantitatively, whether it is the number of articles we publish or the size of the grants we get, or at least in the sciences, the patents we sell to industry. I need not say to this audience that under this factory model, the life of the mind will wither and die. But I would like to stress a factor that I think we have not talked about much, and that is the sheer number of us. There are 30,000 members of the Modern Language Association, actually down a bit from a few years ago, and tens of thousands more literature professors who are not members. A large and growing proportion of us feel compelled to publish books and articles, And we do. One consequence of this compulsion is the publishing crisis we've been talking about for years. The debilitating contradiction between universities' requirement that their professors publish books and the failure of these same universities' libraries to purchase books by professors at other universities. Not to mention the failure of these same universities to support their own presses or subsidize the publication of their own professors' manuscripts. What seems to have happened recently is that the number of copies of scholarly books published has dropped sharply because libraries are no longer buying them, but that the number of titles published has not. It may even be growing, despite this glaring contradiction. Fewer people are reading each book, but books keep pouring out, and usually at very high prices. If a 250-page book published by Ashgate costs $110, only the handful of scholars in that field who have won a grant to buy books will buy it, along with maybe 100 libraries. A typical issue of PMLA carries ads for about 200 books, not counting the MLA's own publications, which make another 200. Academic book catalogs fill our mailboxes and inboxes. In the spring of 2014, to take one at random, Oxford University Press described about 475 books in its new and noteworthy catalog in literature, which runs to 54 pages, not counting online services and journals. The MLA bibliography covers 4,000 journals. I recently checked it for articles on Hamlet and found some 80 items among the first 100 listings published since the beginning of 2010. If you feel you must write an article on Hamlet, you might eliminate most of these articles from their titles alone, such as the comparison of the two translations of Hamlet into Klingon. But I know of at least one professor at my department who's probably read that, if he didn't write it. But you still have to read quite a few, or at least parts of quite a few of these articles. The total for Hamlet back to the earliest book or article is about 5,000, and that doesn't count chapters in books. A 7-page article on Beowulf in a recent issue of PMLA has 139 entries in its works cited section plus 48 footnotes. The fourth and latest MLA survey of scholarship on the Romantics had 765 pages, and it covered only the big 6 male poets, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. It appeared in 1985, and I doubt if we'll ever see another one. When I recite figures like these to friends who are not professors or who are professors in the sciences, they often laugh and shake their heads in pitying disbelief. How did we get into such an absurd pickle? But we can't laugh, not if we're planning an article on Beowulf. We have not only a publishing crisis then, but we have something even less tractable. We have a reading crisis. Whether you're a professor or not, suppose you want to stay abreast of current literature. You want to read the best contemporary novels and short stories. It's difficult to gather consistent data, but we can estimate that the United States published about 300,000 new titles or new editions in 2013, of which perhaps 75,000 were in adult fiction. That's adult as opposed to juvenile. It's probably more than that. That's not counting the number of self-published books, a number now ballooning absurdly, or print-on-demand books from extensive backlists. The United Kingdom published about 200,000 books. Add in Canada, Australia, India, and so on, and we can safely assume that over 150,000 titles in adult fiction appeared last year in English alone. Some of these are reprints of classics, which of course you have already read. You can throw out the new beach books, bodice rippers, airplane books, detective novels, science fiction, whatever you dislike, winnowing it down drastically. But surely there will still be at least 1,000 worthy novels and 10,000 excellent short stories soliciting your attention. Maybe twice that. Why should it be fewer? The population of the earth keeps rising. An ever greater percentage of it speaks English. And there's no reason to think the proportion of those with literary talent has dropped. So this year, more good novels and stories have appeared in English than ever before. Not to mention hundreds of good books translated from foreign languages. If you can manage to read 3 novels a day, you might just about stay afloat. But then, what about last year's flood? And the annual flood's only a little smaller as you go back year by year. And then there's Omu and Felix Holt and the Tale of Genji and a few other little omissions from your heroic reading of the past. Herr Heine Vettermark, by the way, exaggerated. There weren't 1 billion books in 1831. And there still aren't that many. In August 2010, Google estimated there were only 129,864,880 books in existence in the world. I love that precision. It's to the nearest 10. Not counting 16 million government documents. That seems like a low number. But in one way, the problem was worse than Herr Heine Vettermark's number suggests. I don't know about you, but I don't have a perfect memory. I've read Martin Chuzzlewit, but I no longer remember the plot, or most of the characters, or even the most memorable passages. I love Dickens, so I'm sure I'll love Martin Chuzzlewit when I get around to reading it again. So right now it counts as a book I haven't read. Even though, being a slow reader, I must have spent many days on it. Dick Cavett recently told an interviewer in the New York Times that we'd all have been better off to have read half as many books twice. I like that, but why stop at half and twice? For there are a few books that I've read 8 or 10 times, and I know pretty well, and have even taught in courses, but they constantly draw me back to them because they still seem so interesting, so profound, subtle, and wondrous. Perhaps then, under the Dick Cavett theory, I only need 12 books. At any rate, this problem deserves a name. The indelegability of reading, perhaps, or the inclonability of the mind. Other people cannot read for us, and there's only one of each of us. Good writers are legion, but we read alone. It's needless to add that novels and stories and plays and poems are not the end of it. For us literature professors, there is literary theory, much of it laborious, and philosophy and psychology and history and sociology. For us who try to be good citizens, there are books and articles on Syria and China, nuclear weapons and fracking, healthcare and poverty. I feel obliged now and then to read about how global capitalism functions and how we can keep it from destroying us. More heavy work. Sheer curiosity leads me to dip into string theory and artificial intelligence. I have hobbies. Having majored in Greek, I read about Homer and Troy and historical linguistics, just for fun. Most of us read like this. And then, oh yes, we have lives too. And must sleep and eat and go to a movie and teach classes and go to department meetings, of which there seem to be more and more every year, just like books. And be a parent to our children and a spouse to our spouse and a friend to our friends. If all this sounds banal, it should at least remind us of an ideal many of us still wistfully avow. Personal and intellectual well-roundedness, culture, the German Bildung, wisdom, and a balance between the contemplative and active lives. We want to be worthy heirs of the science and culture of the world, knowing enough of them to place their parts in proper relationship to each other, to have a reasonable philosophy of the world. A few years ago, I was asked to rewrite the brief descriptions of each of the new Discovery catalogs in order to bring their styles into harmony. And I found myself pondering what ideal of a well-rounded undergraduate underlies these categories. And then I got to pondering how many professors are well-rounded. And if there are some, how do they stay that way? It would be interesting to know when the last man of leisure, or woman perhaps, managed to read everything important. But it must have been at least 2 centuries ago. It might have been Montaigne. It's impossible for us now. In 1927, Virginia and Leonard Woolf took part in a BBC broadcast on the topic, "Are too many books written and published?" 88 years later, the question hardly needs to be raised. Of course, in one form or another, the question is probably ancient. I have a hunch Montaigne complained about it in one of his essays, but I haven't had time to track it down. I can imagine the librarians of Alexandria during their lunch break wondering where they're going to put the latest batch of papyrus scrolls and who is going to find time to index them. The point, however, is that the numbers are growing exponentially, so the problem today seems utterly different from what it was even a century ago. To quote David Foster Wallace, who agreed to take on the job of selecting the best American essays of 2007, "To really try to be informed and literate today is to feel stupid nearly all the time and to need help." I think he's right. And the really depressing thing about that is that David Foster Wallace himself makes me feel stupid nearly all the time. To keep up with novels and whatever else we pursue, we rely on reviews, on features like the December TLS, survey of recommendations from 50 writers, on advice from friends, on dipping and skimming in bookstores, on selections by the David Foster Wallaces, and so on. And most of us find ways to shrug off our periodic impulses to master the contemporary novel or whatever. We consider it just leisurely reading and follow our noses and not linger too long in the fiction aisles or the library stacks. We might comfort ourselves with the postmodern faith that there are no such things as well-roundedness or mastery of important literature and just enjoy sailing serendipitously on the sea of interesting stuff. But for me, that attitude just won't do. Life is too short. Underlying our habits of browsing randomly in bookshops or on Amazon and picking or clicking something that strikes our fancy, and underlying our custom of recommending books to friends and family members or, alas, giving them books for Christmas, is the implicit assumption that we are going to live forever. But we're not. We're each going to die, and pretty soon, too. We have time to read only so many books. Unless we really think all books are equal, or that we read them just for entertainment, we must be choosy. We need a bucket list. We only go around once, and I refuse to abandon the quaint old idea of cultivation or edification, of ripening slowly into wisdom. There are enough distractions already, enough temptations to browse and surf and graze and click. We don't need postmodernists or post-postmodernists telling us that canons are totalitarian and taste is arbitrary and, oh, by the way, you should read this new novel by a Marxist Muslim woman from Kazakhstan. A bucket list is a kind of canon. Maybe it's your own personal canon as opposed to the canon, which has suffered some rough handling lately. But how do you come up with it? You should give it some thought. Isn't it pretty likely, for instance, that after 2,800 years of discussion, we can now confidently put Homer's two epics on the list? A decent respect for the constant opinions of humankind and an honest assessment of our own limited intellects should lead us to converge on 1,000 books or so. After that, perhaps it's a serendipitous free-for-all. But those 1,000 books, of course we should keep our ears open for new things, yes, but how do you digest and put into your bloodstream even those 1,000 books? Surely they demand priority. And alas again, for those 1,000 books, reading them once isn't enough. The word bucket list at least implies that we don't have a lot of time, and it's therefore more honest than our well-meaning relatives who know we like books, so here's a book. Right? Don't you hate it? I think it was Ringo Starr. It was one of the Beatles who replied to a friend who asked him if he would like a book for Christmas. No, thank you, he said, I already have one. Good for him, I say. The curmudgeon in me has grown to the point where I'm about to start asking my well-meaning relatives just which novel by Dostoevsky I should forever neglect in order to read their Christmas present. Because we must choose. I'm lucky in having a wife who loves to read books and reads them faster than I do. So I can use her as a scout. The greatest service she performs is to tell me not to bother with this or that new novel. Right? We need a bucket list. We also need a list that rhymes with bucket. I'm shocked you got that. So we won't live forever, though we often act as if we will when we choose books to read or recommend to others, but it's a good thing we won't. Just think if we were to live, say, just 100 more years beyond our 70. The thought of living through 25 more presidential elections is enough to make me hang myself. But even if we could retire to the countryside near an excellent independent bookshop and devote all our days to reading, we couldn't keep up. We'd fall farther and farther behind and at an ever faster rate. Think what Joyce Carol Oates would publish if she were to live another 100 years. But we might, given this extra lease of time, do justice to that top 1,000 books. I'm not going to list them. We just argue all day. Anyway, whatever we decide about what to read for our own edification or pleasure, novels or whatever, our decision does not much affect our careers. But the ever-growing tsunami of ever more specialized literary scholarship certainly does, and we cannot shrug it off. I think we are drowning in it. To produce a review of research and criticism of the English Romantic poets today, at the same helpful level of detail as the last version in 1985, would take twice the 765 pages it took then, even if it still confined itself to the canonical male 6. But of course, it could hardly do that after 3 or 4 decades of recovery and interpretation of such female poets as Felicia Hemans and Charlotte Smith, not to mention the elevation of John Clare and new work on the formerly canonical Walter Scott, and so on. If it were produced, who would read it through? I read every page of the 1985 edition. I was slow, but I read it. And I felt briefly that I had acquired a commanding general view of the state of the art. I'll never feel that way again. I note that Carl Kraber, who did the Wordsworth section, 100 pages or more, wrote in February 1982 that the accelerating quantity of scholarship about Wordsworth is a case of suicide through plenitude. I don't want to be taken as saying that all or even most of today's literary scholarship is crap. If only it were. Then we could take a look at each new book in our field and decide in a few minutes if it were worth trying to digest. The trouble is that most of them are at least pretty good, and some are very good. So we need to take account of them if we're not to make a wrong move or sound out of date in our own book. It's bad to get a review that wonders why your bibliography has big gaps. It's bad to get a review like that. It's bad to, well, you might want to reply that if the tide of new work discourages more new work, that's a good thing, because only the most dedicated and intrepid will sally forth against it, and the result would be a fairly steady state in which a general steady state in quantity and a general rise in quality. This is a Darwinian theory of publishing. Just by sheer amount of it, it has to get better. Well, for one thing, it's not just the dedicated and intrepid who will write all these books. It's the desperate and the frightened. It's the ones who need a book for tenure or promotion, or nowadays for any job at all. I've heard from several excellent older scholars, those who might well have it in them to write a really good book, a ripe book, a book from their ripened wisdom that many students in college would profit from, that they have felt discouraged from undertaking it because of the immense preliminary reading they would have to do. The urgent, in other words, is blockading the important. One symptom of this thoughtless drift toward suicide through plenitude is our habitual gesture, which we find in article after article and in book after book, of announcing complications. A missing factor or feature, which everyone before now has overlooked, must always be taken into account. A binary always needs to be deconstructed. Something deeper or more subtle is always lurking. Something other is always in play or at work. In a text we thought we knew. An assertion always needs to be ironized, perspectivized, contextualized, or intertextualized. And we always plume ourselves for pointing out such things. At conference panels, someone always says, "I'd like to complicate that." Right? The most embarrassing situation we can be caught in is to sound naive, another reason we assume the air of having read everything while shrinking the field in which we read. On the face of it, I admit this drive toward complicatedness, it deserves a German name, Jeff. Drang nach Vielfältigkeit. It seems ineluctable. For surely reality really is complicated, and it's our duty to discover it. But I'd like to complicate that idea. Sometimes it's our duty to simplify things, to dismiss back to the margin certain things that deconstructionists argue are central, or to refute some ideas that are simply mistaken and not just one-sided, or to clearly point out the forest and not each tree or each twig. Matthew Arnold wanted us to see life steadily and see it whole. And while it may seem that collectively we are indeed trying to assemble the whole thing by chasing down every last piece of it, these pieces, when they are chased down, have the exasperating habit of hauling new and unsuspected pieces into existence, like subatomic particles. And there's nothing steady about any of it. Meanwhile, life is still short. Our students want something meaningful out of their courses, which are even shorter, and the drive for complexity seems to have become an interminable wallowing in indecision. What is to be done? Let's see if I can think of something. If we carry on as we have been, the publishing crisis will play itself out with the collapse of quite a few university presses or their conversion to semi-vanity presses subvented by their authors. Many journals will collapse too. Their collapse in itself might be no great loss, but if it comes about before universities change their expectations about their professors, it will leave many young ones high and dry at tenure time, if we still have tenure. Cheaper electronic publications look likely to be of some help, but there are costs even there, and in any case we would be left with a reading crisis and the trend toward ever tinier turfs. No doubt there will always be a few scholars with great reading rates and retentive memories, whoever they are, who will write magisterial surveys and assessments of periods and genres. Others will review recent scholarship and help us shake it down to a manageable pile. Yet it is getting harder and harder to do this kind of thing, and we will all depend more and more on it for everything outside our petty specialties. How much longer can we muddle along? I see no solution to this problem except some radical measures that will not be adopted because of the inertia of the profession. One measure adopted by 2 or 3 of the most famous professors at Yale while I was there is to refuse to read what others have written about the work you're writing about. I don't recommend this policy. The results were not good, and you can only get away with it when you become an oracle. My own suggestions, which I offer with genuine misgivings, and I hope you will prove me wrong, go well beyond the several helpful proposals that we have seen offered in recent years, such as requiring 4 or 5 articles for tenure instead of a book, or giving more weight to editions, anthologies, textbooks, and translations as opposed to monographs. I agree with these ideas, but they won't be enough. We need the opposite of Pierre Bayard's self-help plan. We need to know comment ne pas parler des livres que l'on a lus. That is, how to keep ourselves from publishing things we might say about books we have read. Many universities should stop demanding any publications for tenure. Let the candidate write 2 or 3 essays. One of them could be on a set topic. Let the whole department and some outside specialists read them carefully, then assess the qualities of mind they reveal. If the candidate has published something, fine, but that should have no advantage over what's been unpublished. Indeed, the candidate should be discouraged from publishing too much, especially while he or she is young. We should not outsource our judgment of a candidate's scholarship by deferring to a journal's decision to publish it or not. Let candidates show in their scholarship an extension of the traditional undergraduate mission, and write essays or give talks that might inspire students and non-students alike to plunge into a great novel or play or poem. A more valuable thing, surely, than demonstrating yet again that Hamlet deconstructs itself or suppresses something, which will interest 11 professors and their poor graduate students. Let their big scholarly projects incubate for 20 years. And let's all hang over our desk these lines from the poet Margaret Cavendish. "The world hath already such a weight of useless books as it is overfraught. Then pity take, do the world a good turn, and all you write, cast in the fire and burn." She wrote that in 1653. We should reject the tacit assumption that we resemble scientists, who must do research that builds on all previous research in order to make discoveries that in turn will fold into future discoveries. We are not curing cancer or launching probes to Mars, which are vast enterprises entailing the intimate cooperation of thousands of scientists. We are mainly involved in teaching young people to read literature and profit by reading it, and secondarily in training the next generation of teachers. That so many of us churn out monographs and articles is ludicrous. Oprah does more for literature than we do. We do need good editions, of course, accurate translation, some careful and intelligent scholarship, some of which does indeed accumulate and improve our understanding. But there's simply not enough work of this sort for the 30,000 members of the MLA to do. Most of us should do something else and get recognized for it. Teach well, give talks to reading groups, organize discussions between scientists and humanists, write for the local newspaper, take students to plays and concerts. Become really well-rounded. Let your next scholarly article marinate for 5 years. It would be the better for it. I read recently that Cervantes thought he should be admired for what he didn't write. That idea sends a flock of thoughts into the air. And Jorge Luis Borges used to write reviews of books that didn't exist. And when frustrated book lovers confronted him about it, he explained that most ideas for books are really worth only the time it takes to read a review or two. So he would give a plot summary, a quotation to illustrate the style, and a critical judgment, usually mixed. Maybe we should reward our professor for thinking up a good book idea and then not writing it. Well, all right, for thinking up a good book and then reducing it to one article. Instead, we often do the opposite. We get a good idea for an article and then eke it out into several articles and a book. It's a commonplace that English departments have two souls contending in their breasts, as Faust said, and so do all departments in the humanities and perhaps even the social sciences. On the one hand, we're supposed to do research, or in the current catchphrase, make new knowledge. UNH is a research university, so all professors are expected to produce things and quantifiable things and enter them on the new ugly annual report forms designed for the convenience of the administrators. On the other hand, the main original purposes of English departments were to teach the young to read well and deeply, to cultivate their intellects, and to help them choose wisely among values. Though we might feel a little superior in these professionalized days to those goals, most of our time, in fact, is spent teaching undergraduates who have no intention of going on to become professors themselves and do literary research. We do teach quite a few students who plan to teach English in the schools, but they have little interest in research and little need for it. It's not obvious what these students should be taught and how they should be taught it, but surely to make them into apprentice versions of ourselves is to waste their time and ours. So we need to rethink the way we do humanities in our universities. I see no good way forward without drastic measures like these that I've proposed. And I see no sign that any university will take them. The trend seems all the other way. This now gets to be a bummer. I had planned to end my talk here and then invite your responses, and I will in a minute. Ordinarily, I like to be confirmed in my opinions. But in this case, I really would like to be jollied out of them. After all, since I've devoted most of my life to being an English professor, and I'd like to think things won't be too bad for the people that come after me. But I feel I must talk about something else. In the 5 years since I first made these notes, some notes on this topic, it's come home to me with ever-growing force that the students we are teaching today will be facing catastrophes graver than anything since the Civil War, and an endless series of them, as the earth takes its revenge for what we've done to it. We can cling to the hope only that we might mitigate a little the damage we've done and not add to it and much more, but even that hope has been hobbled by the Republican victories last November. They will unleash capitalism even further than it has been since the mid-1970s, an economic system unable to think more than a few years at a time, an economic system that's driven to expand infinitely in a very finite planet. I think I'm not unusual here, and that I fully accept the facts the scientists have been telling us for many years about the heating up of the earth. While at the same time, I've been averting my gaze and running away from them. I am a climate change denier, not in my mind, not even in my actions. For Susan and I marched in New York last September. We sent checks to dozens of environmental groups. We've even put in a geothermal heating system. But I still distract myself from thinking about the coming catastrophes with my habits, my inertia, my little jokes, my continuing to pursue little issues in the faculty senate, and my daily immersion in scholarly trivia, whether it's the Trojan War or string theory. For moments, and I can bear facing it only for moments, the future casts this darkness over my present work, and then most of that work seems pointless. What has this to do with humanities professors and the crisis of scholarship I've been having fun describing? I'm not sure. It seems to compound the crisis, or raise it by an exponent. At the same time, it makes it dwindle into insignificance. But I think if I were the dean of the college, I would declare a permanent emergency. I would say to young professors, teach your students well. Equip them with the wisdom to deal with what is coming. Teach them to love the earth and cherish the best that human culture has come up with. And don't worry about publishing your 5 articles or a book. We'll promote you anyway. If you can do those things and do them well, we'll need you here. Thank you.
plenitude of questions. I
Suicide
hope
by
so.
question.
This is the season of great talks. I include this, I mean, this is a wonderful, great talk. We've heard Michael Roth. Yesterday, I hope some of you had the opportunity to see Robert Reich.
Oh, yes.
And who was fabulous. Michael, you've added to that troika of great talks this
Thank you,
season.
Ken.
So-
And nice of you to come when you could have been outside enjoying this beautiful spring day.
So please ask away.
I think Shelley said that last year when it was a beautiful day. Thoughts? Talk me down. Yes.
Not really a question, but you'll like this part, particularly where you were educated as undergraduate. In the Bryn Mawr Classics Library, there used to be a list that the graduate students put together that they posted, which lists topics that people were not allowed to write on for the next 10 years,
That's a good idea. Yes.
which some of the faculty at Bryn Mawr did not take to heart, but clearly they were very much in tune with their own field and had decided what they did not need to read any more of.
That's a very nice idea, isn't it? Just put a little, just a curfew on some of these things.
Right. So maybe you need a journal that's devoted exclusively to publishing things that people should not write on
Wait a
in the
minute.
future.
Right. That's the, isn't that the Cretan paradox? Right. I often wonder about classics because, I mean, there's only a limited amount of ancient literature, right? Of course, there aren't as many of you as there are in the English field. But it must be sometimes frustrating to feel, I mean, what can you say that's new about Homer? And yet, I don't mean to say there isn't excellent scholarship being produced and new ideas. It just seems like there's just too much that's just in the way and not really adding much. David, you had your hand up.
I have two responses, or actually three responses. The first one is I haven't been to a talk I've enjoyed so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have two solutions, both of which I have done.
Yes.
I don't think anyone else can do them. I jumped ship. I was a professor of English. I'm now a professor of theater, which means I don't have to read anything, and I'm expected to read anything. I recommend that. And the other solution is to stop writing and teach more. So,
Thank you. Andy.
I have a question for the dean. I'm wondering how you respond to Professor Ferber's proposal to revamp the tenure system.
Ask me after June 30th. I'm tired. Michael and I have talked about this quite frequently.
We have.
Actually, so it's not new to me, and it's an idea that I've tossed around. But Michael also refers to a very important word, and nothing that this little person has much control over, and that's inertia. I don't know what to say, Andy. In the year that I have remaining, it's something to think about. I have to applaud David Richmond for putting his money where his mouth is. I mean, he's done just that, and is teaching more in lieu of adding to the reams of scholarship. But I think we need to see more of that.
Janet.
Yeah, I wonder if it's not only teaching more, but teaching differently. And I would refer to the end of your talk, which I don't find moving in at all. And in the sense that, I mean, I'm just thinking of having been able to lead a discussion with ideas that Sis and Bill had generated in humanities. So we had to talk about Darwin and Courbet in the same class with undergraduates from mechanical engineering all over. How do we, given our requirements, and what do we need to change about the way we see our teaching? You know, you have to do a third of major requirements and a third of discovery courses, which are humongous courses. And then you can play for a third, maybe, for our students say, well, I've done all my requirements, what do I do next?
I'll be a double major.
Yeah, how do we as professors then teach as you're suggesting at the end?
Well, I was moved by Michael Roth's term animate. His four categories: liberate, animate, cooperate, instigate. Animate was a good one, I thought. How do you make it alive in class? You know, sometimes being a sage on the stage may be the best way to make it alive. Sometimes close conversations in a small group is better. I don't know, but I think some of us, well, we all get tired and repetitive, but yeah, let's talk about this. Jeff.
If UNH were to hire a new librarian who wanted to dispose of a high percentage of books in the library, would you agree with that? And if so, what standards would you offer for disposal?
I've sometimes thought that we could all make a contribution, like being allowed once in our career to nominate a book for permanent extinction. But of course, we'd have to leave a trace of it somewhere, right? It's like going into a black hole. If Hawking is right, there is a little trace of stuff that goes into a black hole. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me they could be. I mean, Google Books has done a marvelous thing in a way by bringing zillions of books back to life and available, but I think they have forgotten something. That a lot of these were, you know, there's a reason they were neglected for centuries. So what are we going to do? Are we just, and it's not so much even that these are bad books or they should be totally forgotten. It's that, are we supposed to spend our time as scholars in the humanities trawling through all this stuff and coming up with some thesis about what happened long ago in certain books and writers? It's not that it's necessarily bad, it's probably harmless, but aren't there more important things for us to be doing as teachers, at least of undergraduates, than a lot of that? So it's not so much I want to really get rid of these books, as besides the librarian doesn't seem to want to consult us about getting rid of books. As we learned, there was Sis Height upside down in a dumpster last spring.
So we can't do that, though. I mean, and we shouldn't do that because one of the interesting things that's going on in early modern philosophy right now is there is a huge amount of work being done. First of all, finding writings by early modern women philosophers that have just simply not been known. And so not only are we finding the correspondence between, we always know the correspondence between Lady Massa and Leibniz, we're now finding more and more of that. We're also finding that some of these philosophers wrote back to them and they actually had relationships, intellectual relationships with them. And if people just read the Descartes' Meditations and don't do this work, we will have an incomplete account of what intellectual life was in that period. And this is an enormous amount of tedious work by very fine-grained minds, I think. And I'm glad they're doing it.
I am too. And Charlotte last fall was telling us about the dialogue between Princess Elizabeth and Descartes, back and forth, and how Descartes seemed to miss the point or something. It was very interesting. Again, it's not that there's any.
Than that now, though. I mean, there's so much that we're discovering, and people have to do this, or we're gonna.
All I would say is, why do undergraduates take philosophy courses? You know, isn't it to like improve their philosophy of life? That's why I started taking philosophy courses. I remember signing up for a seminar in ethics as an undergraduate, and I divided my notebook in half. The first half was called My Ethical Philosophy, and the second half was going to be notes on what we read. And at the end of this semester, I had 3 sentences under My Ethical Philosophy and 150 pages of notes on what I read. It was just I learned a lot, and I know there were some really smart ethicists in the past, but I didn't feel like that philosophy was getting me to what I thought the tradition of philosophy has been since the ancient Greeks, which is to make us lead better lives. So I don't want us to forget this kind of thing. Of course, the scholarship is fine, and a certain amount of it is essential. There's some very good people doing it, but in the end, aren't our students hungry for something more than scholarship? They're hungry for meaning, for purpose, for enhancing their lives. And I hope we can just keep doing that. And maybe scholarship can be folded in beautifully into that, but I'm not sure it always is. Sarah?
Yeah. I'm not sure how to articulate this, but I'm sort of picking up on what Ruth, I think, was getting at. And that is, I understand exactly, I think, what you're saying, that there's an awful lot of very mediocre stuff being published that we don't really need to worry about. I'm reminded of growing up in my parents' radio station And we got constant shipments of demo records from completely unknown rock and roll groups, and just piles of them, and my sister and I would frisbee them across the room because they were useless and were just about to be thrown out.
I hadn't thought of that.
You know, but it taught me that picking the hits is very important, and that there's a massive amount of junk that's produced across all kinds of fields. But for the stuff, for the hits, the things that really are transformative, that open up new ways of seeing and change the way we teach and change the way we understand our moment, that's important for teaching our students. There has to be a place for that, because it's been very humbling for me in my field, for example, the recovery of text by, say, African American writers. That has changed my perception of canonical text. I don't teach, the great white American writers like Fitzgerald the way I did 20 years ago. I teach them very differently. And I think the way I teach them is important for helping my students understand the world that they live in. So I think there's an important place for scholarship and ongoing scholarship.
Of course, first of all, I meant to exclude everyone in this room. Secondly, I agree. When anyone tells me about any particular kind of scholarship, I find myself really interested in it, including my own. But I just feel that while you can sort of endorse every part of it, it just seems collectively it changes the whole world, the world we teach in and the problems we have. It's just the massive amount of it is what I'm trying to get at. And if trouble is it's not all mediocre. There's a great deal of it that's at least pretty good. If it were all mediocre, or at least we could tell quickly if it was, that would be one thing. But I don't want to read 129 articles on Beowulf in order to make some little move in Beowulf scholarship. Recovery of text, yes, has been very important in my field as well, to look again at what some of the women poets that were once popular and then forgotten and so on have done, and I agree. I'm just worried about the sheer amount of this and how so many universities are now requiring us to do this in the humanities. When I arrived, well, you were here before me.
Yeah.
The English department had quite a few older people here who were not publishing much. They were splendid teachers and devoted to the place, and I think doing a lot of good undergraduate teaching. But then we decided to have a graduate program and a PhD program, and I think we decided to level up to a Research 2 or something university. So we decided everybody had to be a publishing scholar that we hired. They're all great. I love my department. I just wonder whether that was totally the right decision for us to do. It seems to me there should be room, even in our department, to have people who are just great teachers. And we should promote them. I don't know. Ken?
So I'm curious to hear your reaction to this that heard you. So I think of the analogy of going out to eat at restaurants, especially in a big city. And so, one's obsession with reading all the canonical works, or if you apply that to eating at the very best, having a bucket list of the very best restaurants in New York City, you couldn't possibly do it. And I think somebody once calculated that in order to do that, given the turnover in restaurants, it would be an impossible task. It's easy to accept the idea that, okay, I'm just going to go out down the street and go try this restaurant or that, because it's almost purely hedonistic. And yet, with the humanities and the arts, less so with the arts, which is perhaps more so hedonistic than the humanities, but one could argue that the idea of a true liberal education is highly hedonistic, and that one learns for learning's sake, without any obsession for the utility of that learning. And so reading is very much like that. You read what's available. I know that's the way I read. Somebody puts a book in my desk or in my Christmas stocking, and that's what I read. I can't, the emotional investment with trying to decide what to read is just too great for me, given.
I'll tell you.
You have told me. You have. So
well,
I guess
think
I'm saying,
that's one
if
side
we
of
think
reading.
of it as a hedonistic approach,
Yeah, I just don't agree that our reading should be hedonistic altogether. I mean, that's one side of it. We read for fun. Why not? I'm not a killjoy, but I mean, there is.
But you
if you
also
see,
take philosophy courses. That's what I'm suggesting.
yeah, all right. But I mean, even if just reading for your own edification, if it's edification instead of just hedonism, that becomes more serious. And choices have to be made. And you might as well read what used to be in the canon, because chances are it's pretty good if people still think it's in the canon, even though we've all learned that canons are totalitarian impositions or whatever. So I don't know. I don't think I'm just getting conservative because I'm now 70, but still, it seems to me there's certain things you must not miss in life if you're serious about cultivating your mind. And in fact, the sooner you get to them, the better. And too much serendipity, that's fine for weekends. I don't know. I feel there's two kinds of reading. Sorry, Jan.
I just wonder, Michael, to what degree you're worrying about a problem that's solving itself in a way that we might not welcome. I mean, in all sorts of ways, the publishing enterprise, the air is going out of the balloon. The libraries are throwing out the books. They're not buying so many books. As you say, university presses are having their subventions withdrawn. Monographs are now being published in print runs of 150 or less. And on the other hand, we have the whole electronic media through which, to which we're directing so much of our reading. So I think we're in a situation where we have to re-strategize our non-reading of things. I remember, Ken possibly knows this in the literature, I remember talking to a psychologist years ago who said she was researching the ways people didn't read things. Because potentially, you could read everything that's placed in front of you in the course of a day. Obviously, you don't do that. You don't actually read the back of every cereal packet, the breakfast table, and so on. You put things in certain places with the intention of maybe reading them at a certain point or a certain contingencies arise. You delete some emails without reading them, and so on and so forth. There are a whole variety of ways in which you decide not to read certain things. And I think we're in a situation where the media are changing in a way which is causing us to have to rethink how we do all that.
That's very good. But your first point about how the problem may be taking care of itself, I'm not sure I see that in the numbers. It's true, smaller print runs, et cetera, and presses going out of business, libraries cutting back, but the books are still being published in some form. And if they're on your topic, as a professor, you'd better read it or someone will point it out. So I think that burden...
in your library.
Well, but that makes it just harder. I mean, you still got to get it. So I think that problem still remains. And I have heard from lots of people who say, I wanted to write another book and I just can't. I just can't get through it. I can't get through all the stuff I'd have to read. Some an eminent professor at Cambridge University felt this way. So I think it's beginning to really bother people. Let me end with just one little sort of personal bit. I was surprised one of you asked why I'm not practicing when I preach. I've written a lot of books. But the truth is that I've only published one monograph. And I published that before I came here. It got me my job here, so I'm glad I did. But on coming here, I realized I was teaching students rather different from the ones I was used to at Yale or Harvard. And some of them were excellent, but a lot of them were rather poorly prepared. So I started thinking more and more about introductions. So I've published 4 introductory books and a dictionary of literary symbols. One thing I can say for them is that they sell 10 times as much as a monograph does, at least my monograph. It's not huge, but it's an order of magnitude greater. People actually do read them, and I feel I'm doing more good by helping younger, beginning readers get hold of Romanticism or Blake or whatever it is that way than by writing another monograph, which the world is not waiting for. If I were a better-known scholar or famous for some new theory, maybe there'd be demand for stuff of that sort for me, but there isn't. But I know I'm pretty good at writing introductions, so I do that. And I think part of that's because I came here. And here are some sort of good average students of every sort from New Hampshire, some very well prepared and ready to go, some brilliant, and some really shouldn't be here, but they've been all in my class. and I've got to cope with them. And that helped me to rethink what I want to do. I'm not holding myself up as a model for this, but at least it showed one way, not as dramatic as David's switch, but something like that I'm now doing less and less. I still write esoteric little articles for the 30 other people who care about these things, but mostly it's in a new direction.
Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you.